The ocean is a realm of unimaginable terror, an abyss defined by crushing hydrostatic pressure, absolute freezing darkness, and predatory nightmares that lurk in the shadows. To most life on Earth, the midnight zone is a hostile, alien frontier where survival means adapting to extreme deprivation. Yet, there is one apex predator that the abyss itself fears, a creature so evolutionarily advanced, so perfectly engineered for destruction, that it descends thousands of meters into this pitch-black void, not merely to survive, but to conquer. It is a living, breathing leviathan, armed with the most powerful biological sonar on our planet, plunging into the deep to hunt the most elusive and terrifying monsters of the ocean. This is the sperm whale, the undisputed king of the deep sea. While surface predators rely on light and speed, the sperm whale relies on sheer biomechanical supremacy. It transforms its massive body to withstand pressures that would crumple submarines made of solid titanium. It voluntarily collapses its own lungs to cheat decompression sickness, stores vast reserves of oxygen in its deep muscle tissues, and weaponizes sound itself. Emitting rhythmic clicks that rip through the dense water at over 200 decibels, this biological machine hunts giant squids in a sensory environment where vision is entirely useless. The deep sea does not fear the sperm whale simply because of its immense size, but because of its terrifying anatomical perfection. It is a masterclass in evolutionary bioacoustics, fluid mechanics, and extreme physiology. Today we will learn about why the deep sea fears sperm whales, unpacking the extreme science behind their anatomy, their acoustic weaponry, and their epic battles in the darkest depths of the ocean. If you are ready to explore the extreme biology of this oceanic titan, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to support our journey into the deep. Also, be sure to drop a comment below letting us know exactly where and what time you're watching this video. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of the sperm whale's biological engineering, we must first plunge into the unforgiving physics of the deep ocean and understand the invisible, omnidirectional force known as hydrostatic pressure. At sea level, terrestrial animals, including humans, live under one atmosphere of pressure. This is the weight of the Earth's entire atmospheric column pressing down upon us. Because our bodies evolved in this environment, and because the internal pressure of our biological fluids pushes outward with equal force, we do not feel this weight. However, water is roughly 800 times denser than air. When you enter the ocean, the physical rules of survival change drastically and violently. For every 10 meters you descend into the water column, the hydrostatic pressure increases by exactly 1 atmosphere. This is not a gradual, gentle increase. It is a linear and compounding accumulation of crushing force. When a sperm whale dives into the abyss, it leaves the sunlit surface layer and rapidly enters the twilight zone and eventually the midnight zone, reaching depths of 2,000 to 3,000 meters. To calculate the pressure at these extreme depths, physicists use a fundamental equation where hydrostatic pressure equals the density of the fluid multiplied by the acceleration due to gravity, multiplied by the depth. Given that the density of seawater is approximately 1,024 kilograms per cubic meter, and the gravitational pull is constant, the resulting force at a depth of 3,000 meters is staggering. At this depth, the ocean exerts a pressure of 300 atmospheres. To put that into perspective, 300 atmospheres translates to approximately 4,400 pounds of force, pressing down on every single square inch of the whale's body. If you were to take a standard steel cylinder or a heavily armoured military submarine not specifically designed for this exact depth, the immense hydrostatic force would cause a catastrophic implosion in a fraction of a second, violently crumpling solid metal as if it were nothing more than a fragile aluminum can. Hydrostatic pressure in a fluid environment does not merely press down from above. According to the principles of fluid mechanics, this pressure is isotropic, meaning it exerts force equally from all directions at once. It pushes inward on the top, the bottom, and the sides of any object submerged in it. For a biological organism, this means that any empty space, any cavity filled with compressible gas, will be violently crushed as the surrounding pressure seeks to equalize. Yet, the sperm whale does not get crushed. It thrives. It navigates this hostile frontier with the grace of an apex predator. The secret to this survival does not lie in building a rigid, impenetrable armor to fight the pressure, but in a profound evolutionary strategy of biomechanical adaptation and yielding, beginning with the largest and most bizarrely constructed skull in the entire animal kingdom. The skull of the sperm whale is a masterpiece of extreme evolutionary engineering. Taking up nearly 1/3 of the animal's entire body length, it looks less like a traditional mammalian skeleton and more like a colossal, hollowed-out chariot or a gigantic biological amphitheatre. To survive the deep, the sperm whale has undergone a radical anatomical transformation known as cranial telescoping. Over millions of years of evolution, the bones of the whale's upper jaw, the maxillae and premaxillae, elongated and slid backward, overlapping the frontal bones and effectively telescoping over the brain case. This evolutionary sliding created a massive solid buttress of overlapping bone. By fusing and layering these cranial plates, the skull functions as a high-strength, shock-absorbing chassis. It forms a deep, concave basin designed specifically to cradle and support the enormous, oil-filled Spermaceti organ, which we will explore in detail later. But the most striking structural anomaly of the sperm whale's skull is not just its massive size or its telescoping architecture. It is the extreme cranial asymmetry. If you were to draw a line down the centre of a human skull, or the skull of a dog, or even a baleen whale, you would find a relatively perfect mirror image on both sides. The sperm whale, however, possesses one of the most asymmetrical skulls of any vertebrate on Earth. The entire bony structure of the face and the nasal passages is heavily skewed, twisted predominantly toward the left side. The left bony nares, or nasal opening, is massive and positioned far to the left, serving the primary function of breathing through the blowhole. The right nasal opening, meanwhile, is drastically reduced in size, highly modified, and repurposed entirely for the acoustic system, acting as a pneumatic tube to drive the whale's sonar. From a biomechanical and hydrostatic perspective, this extreme asymmetry seems counterintuitive. In engineering, symmetry is typically associated with equal distribution of stress and structural stability. Why would an animal subjected to the most immense crushing forces on the planet evolve a lopsided skull? The answer lies in the complex interplay between pressure management, buoyancy control, and acoustic weaponization. The asymmetrical bony basin of the skull creates a specialized cradle that allows the massive Spermaceti organ to change its physical state and density without fracturing the surrounding bone. As the whale dives and the hydrostatic pressure increases exponentially, the immense volume of acoustic fats and waxes inside the head begins to compress and change in density. If the skull were perfectly symmetrical and rigid, the localized stress concentrations caused by the shifting weight and density of these internal structures under 300 atmospheres of pressure could cause catastrophic structural failure, literally cracking the skull from the inside out. Instead, the asymmetrical ridges, the heavy crests of bone on one side, and the sprawling concavity act as a dynamic load-bearing system. The asymmetry distributes the internal mechanical stress unevenly, but intentionally, channeling the forces away from the fragile brain case and transferring them into the massive shock-absorbing tissues of the head. It is a biological suspension system designed to handle not just the external isotropic squeeze of the ocean, but the internal shifting of the whale's own biological machinery. Furthermore, this twisted architecture allows the acoustic soft tissues to be arranged in a specific geometry, optimizing the production and reflection of sound waves without compromising the structural integrity of the cranium under immense depth. Beyond the shape of the skull, we must also examine the material science of the bone itself. The skeletal structure of a sperm whale is remarkably different from the dense, brittle bones of terrestrial mammals. To resist the crushing pressure of the midnight zone, The whale's bones have evolved to be highly porous and spongy, particularly within the massive rostrum and cranial crests. In a terrestrial animal, porous bone might imply weakness, but in the deep ocean, it is a brilliant adaptation. These pores and microscopic cavities within the bone matrix are completely saturated with naturally occurring oils and lipid fluids. Because fluids are virtually incompressible, this oil-soaked spongy bone acts as a perfect countermeasure to hydrostatic pressure. When the ocean presses inward with thousands of pounds of force per square inch, the oil trapped inside the skeletal matrix pushes back with equal and opposite force. The bone does not snap or splinter because there are no rigid, air-filled voids to collapse. The entire skull reaches a state of hydrostatic equilibrium with the surrounding ocean. It becomes an integral part of the fluid environment, absorbing the pressure rather than fighting it. This unique combination of oil-saturated bone density, cranial telescoping and extreme structural asymmetry transforms the sperm whale's head into an indestructible biological pressure vessel. It allows the leviathan to dive headfirst into an abyss that would obliterate our most advanced machines, turning the crushing weight of the deep sea into merely the operating environment for its supreme acoustic arsenal. Having established the sheer, crushing force of hydrostatic pressure that dictates the architecture of the sperm whale's skull, we must now confront the ultimate biological paradox of this deep-sea titan. The sperm whale is not a fish. It does not possess gills to extract dissolved oxygen from the water. It is a mammal, fundamentally bound to the surface, requiring atmospheric air to survive. This reliance on air introduces a massive vulnerability when diving into the abyss. In the realm of high-pressure physics, liquids and solids are largely incompressible, but gases are extremely compressible. This fundamental principle is described by Boyle's law, a cornerstone of fluid dynamics, which states that the volume of a gas is inversely proportional to the pressure exerted upon it. When you take a volume of air from the surface and drag it down to a depth of 1,000 meters, where the pressure is 100 atmospheres, that volume of gas is compressed to a mere 1% of its original size. For an air-breathing mammal, possessing 2 large bags of gas inside a rigid chest cavity is a catastrophic evolutionary liability. If a human was somehow dragged to the depths where a sperm whale hunts, the immense pressure would cause the air inside the lungs to compress so violently that the rib cage would completely cave in, shattering the bones and driving them into the vital organs. Yet the mechanical crushing of the chest is only the beginning of the danger. The true silent killer of the deep is a biochemical phenomenon known as decompression sickness, more commonly referred to as the bends. To understand how the sperm whale conquers this threat, we must first understand why human divers succumb to it. The air we breathe at the surface is a mixture composed roughly of 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. When a human scuba diver breathes compressed air from a tank at depth, they are introducing this nitrogen into their lungs under extreme ambient pressure. Here, we encounter another fundamental law of physics, Henry's law. Henry's law states that the amount of dissolved gas in a liquid is directly proportional to the partial pressure of that gas above the liquid. At sea level, the nitrogen in our lungs does not easily dissolve into our blood. However, as a diver descends and the pressure exponentially increases, the nitrogen gas is literally forced across the extremely thin respiratory membranes of the alveoli, the microscopic air sacs deep within the lungs where gas exchange occurs. Under high pressure, the nitrogen becomes highly soluble and saturates the blood plasma and the surrounding tissues. As long as the diver remains at depth under high pressure, this dissolved nitrogen remains safely in solution, completely invisible and largely harmless, save for the risk of nitrogen narcosis. The deadly sequence is initiated not during the descent but during the ascent. If an organism saturated with dissolved nitrogen ascends too rapidly, the ambient hydrostatic pressure drops abruptly. Because the pressure keeping the gas in solution is suddenly removed, the nitrogen rapidly comes out of solution and reverts to a gaseous state. You can witness this exact physical reaction every time you quickly unscrew the cap off a pressurized bottle of carbonated soda. The sudden drop in pressure causes dissolved carbon dioxide to rapidly form gas bubbles that rush to the surface. Inside a living circulatory system, however, this bubbling effect is utterly devastating. Microscopic nitrogen bubbles form inside the bloodstream and tissues, acting as physical blockages. These bubbles lodge inside the narrow capillaries of the joints, the spinal cord, the brain, and the heart. They cut off blood circulation, causing acute ischemia, localized tissue death, excruciating neurological pain, paralysis, and frequently a rapid death. The sperm whale dives to depths exponentially greater than any human scuba diver, and it ascends rapidly without suffering any ill effects from decompression sickness. How does it cheat Henry's law? The answer is a breathtaking piece of evolutionary engineering. Instead of fighting the immense hydrostatic pressure to keep its lungs open, the sperm whale voluntarily surrenders to it. It executes a highly controlled biological structural failure known as atelectasis, which is the complete and deliberate collapse of the lungs. This mechanism requires a radically redesigned respiratory and skeletal system. Unlike the rigid, fixed rib cage of a human, the rib cage of a sperm whale is highly flexible. The ribs are attached to the spine with specialized loose cartilaginous joints that act like highly articulated hinges. As the whale descends past the first 100 meters and the hydrostatic pressure begins its deadly squeeze, the rib cage does not resist. Instead, it folds inward, collapsing seamlessly under the weight of the ocean, safely allowing the internal volume of the chest cavity to shrink in tandem with the compressing gas. But merely shrinking the chest cavity is not enough to prevent the bends. The whale must stop the biochemical transfer of nitrogen into its blood. This is where the internal architecture of the whale's respiratory tract demonstrates its true genius. The respiratory system of a mammal is divided into two main zones. The first is the respiratory zone, consisting of the millions of microscopic, highly permeable alveoli, where the blood-gas barrier is thinnest and gas exchange takes place. The second is the conducting zone, which includes the trachea, the bronchi, and the larger bronchioles. This conducting zone is lined with thick cartilage and dense tissue, and no gas exchange can occur here. In physiology, this non-exchanging region is known as the anatomical dead space. As the hydrostatic pressure folds the whale's rib cage inward, the lungs are compressed from the bottom up. The delicate, highly flexible alveoli at the base of the lungs are the first to completely flatten. Because the whale's trachea and upper bronchi are heavily reinforced with thick, rigid rings of cartilage, they do not collapse, they remain open. As the pressure mounts, the highly compressed volume of air remaining in the lungs is physically squeezed out of the collapsing alveoli and pushed upward into this rigid, reinforced anatomical dead space. By the time the sperm whale reaches a depth of about 100 to 200 meters, its alveoli are squeezed entirely shut. This localized alveolar collapse is the biological switch that saves the whale's life. Because all the remaining air has been forced into the thick-walled upper airways, where the blood vessels are isolated from the gas exchange completely ceases. The pathway for nitrogen to enter the bloodstream is physically sealed off by the crushing pressure of the ocean. The whale effectively unplugs its own lungs. With the gas exchange halted, no extra nitrogen can dissolve into the blood or tissues, no matter how deep the whale plunges or how immense the partial pressures become. By the time the whale reaches its hunting grounds at 2,000 meters down, it is entirely immune to Henry's law because the gaseous nitrogen is locked safely in the dead space, completely unable to interact with the circulatory system. Consequently, when the titanic battle in the dark is over and the whale ascends rapidly to the surface, there is no excess nitrogen in its tissues to form bubbles. The bends simply cannot occur. However, completely collapsing the delicate alveolar sacs creates an entirely new mechanical problem. In a normal terrestrial mammal, if the microscopic walls of the alveoli touch each other, the natural surface tension of the fluid lining them causes the walls to stick together permanently, similar to how two wet panes of glass become incredibly difficult to pull apart. If the whale's lungs glued themselves shut during a deep dive, it would never be able to take another breath upon reaching the surface. To prevent this fatal adhesion, the sperm whale possesses specialized cells in its lungs that secrete massive quantities of highly potent pulmonary surfactants. Surfactants are complex biochemical mixtures of lipids and proteins that vastly lower the surface tension of fluids. This oily, biological lubricant heavily coats the inner lining of the whale's alveoli. When the whale begins its ascent from the abyss, the hydrostatic pressure decreases rapidly. As the pressure drops, the highly compressed air stored safely in the reinforced upper airways naturally begins to expand according to Boyle's law. Because the walls of the alveoli are heavily lubricated with this specialized surfactant, they easily unstick and glide open without tearing or resisting. The expanding air rushes smoothly back down the respiratory tract, seamlessly reinflating the billions of microscopic air sacs. By the time the sperm whale breaks the surface of the ocean, its lungs are fully expanded, readied for the explosive exhalation that clears the system before drawing in the next massive breath of fresh, oxygen-rich air. Through the masterful utilization of flexible ribs, alveolar isolation, and biochemical lubrication, the sperm whale turns the crushing, deadly pressure of the deep sea into the very mechanism that keeps its blood free of nitrogen. But this extreme adaptation begs an entirely new question. If the whale shuts down its lungs completely at the beginning of the dive, thereby halting the absorption of oxygen, how can this colossal, warm-blooded mammal sustain the enormous physical energy required to hunt the most dangerous prey on Earth in complete darkness for over an hour and a half without taking a single breath? Having established that the sperm whale deliberately collapses its lungs and completely halts gas exchange within the first few hundred meters of its descent, we are immediately confronted with a profound physiological paradox. For the next 90 minutes, this massive endothermic predator will plunge into the freezing lightless abyss. It will engage in extreme physical exertion, battling giant squids with explosive bursts of speed and immense muscular force. Every muscular contraction, every firing of a neuron, and every beat of its colossal heart requires a continuous massive supply of oxygen to fuel the production of adenosine triphosphate, the cellular energy currency. If the lungs are flattened and completely offline, functioning merely as crushed biological sacs, where does the sperm whale get the oxygen required to sustain this titanic expenditure of energy? The answer lies in a radical evolutionary reimagining of the mammalian oxygen storage and distribution systems. To understand the genius of the sperm whale, we must first abandon the human paradigm of respiration. When a human takes a deep breath before submerging, they are relying almost entirely on their lungs as an oxygen reservoir. In a terrestrial mammal, the lungs hold a significant majority of the body's total available oxygen. For a deep-diving leviathan, however, storing oxygen in a compressible gaseous state within a fragile hollow cavity is an evolutionary dead end, as we saw with the threat of decompression sickness. Therefore, the sperm whale has shifted its oxygen storage away from the vulnerable gaseous environment of the lungs and directly into the incompressible, fluid, and dense tissues of its own body. Specifically, it has weaponized its blood and its muscles to act as massive, localized chemical batteries for oxygen. The first line of this biochemical defense is the whale's circulatory system. A sperm whale possesses an extraordinarily high blood volume relative to its body mass. While a human might have a blood volume accounting for roughly 7% of their total weight, a sperm whale's blood can make up to 20% of its massive bulk. Furthermore, this ocean of blood is biologically supercharged. It possesses a vastly higher hematocrit, which is the sheer volume percentage of red blood cells. Inside these red blood cells is the protein hemoglobin, the molecular taxicab responsible for binding and transporting oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body. Because the whale's blood is incredibly thick with hemoglobin, it can load a staggering amount of oxygen during the brief periods it spends hyperventilating at the surface before a dive. However, Even this supercharged, highly concentrated blood supply is not sufficient to power a 50-ton animal through a 90-minute underwater battle. The brain and the heart, the most vital and oxygen-hungry organs in the mammalian body, will rapidly consume the oxygen circulating in the bloodstream. If the whale's enormous skeletal muscles also drew their oxygen from this circulating blood during the dive, the system would be depleted in a matter of minutes, leading to catastrophic asphyxiation and death. The evolutionary solution to this energy crisis is an extreme reliance on a second oxygen-binding protein called myoglobin. While hemoglobin transports oxygen through the blood, myoglobin is the protein responsible for receiving that oxygen and storing it directly within the muscle tissue itself. Myoglobin is essentially a localized oxygen reservoir for the muscle fibers, allowing them to perform aerobic respiration and contract forcefully without constantly draining the main circulatory supply. In human skeletal muscle, myoglobin is present in relatively low concentrations, giving our muscle tissue its characteristic red color. If you were to cut into the deep skeletal muscle of a sperm whale, however, you would not see red meat. You would see muscle tissue that is so incredibly dark it is almost entirely pitch black. This dark, almost tar-like coloration is the visual manifestation of an extreme biochemical adaptation, the highest concentration of myoglobin found in any living animal. Sperm whale muscle tissue is absolutely saturated with myoglobin, possessing up to 10 to 20 times the concentration found in human muscles. This allows the whale's muscles to function as gigantic, self-contained oxygen batteries. But packing this much protein into a muscle cell presents a severe biochemical hazard. Proteins are complex, folded molecular structures. When packed too densely, normal mammalian myoglobin proteins tend to stick together, clumping up in a process called aggregation. If myoglobin proteins aggregate, they lose their structural integrity and their ability to bind to oxygen, rendering them useless and potentially causing toxic damage to the muscle tissue. How does the sperm whale pack so much myoglobin into its muscles without the proteins clumping together into a useless biological paste? The answer is a masterpiece of molecular evolution. Over millions of years, the genetic code of the sperm whale has been modified to alter the amino acid sequence on the exterior surface of its myoglobin proteins. Specifically, the evolutionary process selected for positively charged amino acids. As a result, the outer shell of every single myoglobin molecule in a sperm whale's muscle carries a strong positive electrostatic charge. In physics, like charges repel one another. Just as the positive poles of two incredibly strong magnets will forcefully push away from each other if forced together, the billions of myoglobin proteins inside the whale's muscle fibers constantly repel one another. This electrostatic repulsion acts as an invisible molecular force field, allowing the whale to pack its muscle cells to the absolute breaking point with myoglobin without the proteins ever touching or clumping together. This simple yet profound molecular tweak allows the whale to store a mind-boggling volume of oxygen directly within its swimming muscles. Having built an unprecedented chemical storage system, the whale must now master the economics of oxygen consumption. Possessing a massive fuel tank means nothing if the engine burns through the supply too quickly. The moment the sperm whale's face slips beneath the surface of the ocean, an automatic, incredibly powerful neurological response is triggered, the mammalian dive reflex. This reflex orchestrates a radical, system-wide shutdown of non-essential physiological functions, entering a state of extreme metabolic conservation. The most immediate and dramatic change is intense bradycardia, a massive slowing of the heart rate. At the surface, a resting sperm whale might have a heart rate of roughly 60 beats per minute. As it descends into the abyss, the parasympathetic nervous system overrides the heart's pacemaker, forcing the heart rate to plummet to as low as 10 or even 5 beats per minute. This extreme reduction in cardiac output immediately drastically slashes the heart muscle's own oxygen consumption, conserving the precious oxygen bound to the circulating hemoglobin. Simultaneously, the whale initiates extreme peripheral vasoconstriction. Throughout the body, the smooth muscles lining the walls of the arteries and arterioles clamp down with immense force, physically squeezing the blood vessels shut and restricting blood flow to vast regions of the body. The circulatory system essentially cuts off the skin, the digestive tract, the kidneys, and all non-essential organs from the main blood supply. Most remarkably, it heavily restricts the blood supply to the very skeletal muscles that are propelling the whale through the water. This targeted starvation of the body is a calculated, brutal triage. By cutting off blood flow to the extremities and the massive muscle blocks, the whale forcefully reserves the highly oxygenated blood in its core, ensuring that the brain and the heart, organs that will suffer irreversible tissue death if deprived of oxygen for even a few minutes, have an exclusive continuous supply for the duration of the hour-and-a-half dive. Because the massive swimming muscles and the powerful jaw muscles are cut off from the circulating blood by this extreme vasoconstriction, they must operate in a state of localized ischemia, meaning they are completely isolated from the central cardiovascular system. This is where the electrostatic myoglobin battery comes into play. Cut off from the heart and the lungs, the deep muscles of the sperm whale operate entirely autonomously, drawing strictly upon the massive reserves of oxygen bound to their perfectly spaced myoglobin proteins. The muscles become an independent, self-sustaining submarine within the larger submarine of the whale's body. Eventually, however, even the colossal myoglobin battery begins to run dry. As the Titan battles a giant squid in the depths, the oxygen levels within the muscle tissue inevitably plummet towards zero. But the whale does not drown, and its muscles do not seize. When the localized oxygen is depleted, the muscle cells seamlessly switch their metabolic pathways from aerobic respiration to anaerobic glycolysis. This chemical process allows the muscles to continue producing energy and contracting violently without any oxygen at all. The byproduct of this emergency anaerobic system is the massive accumulation of lactic acid. In a human, even a moderate buildup of lactic acid causes severe muscle fatigue, intense burning pain, and eventually a total failure of the muscle to contract. The sperm whale, however, is biologically engineered to tolerate profound levels of muscular acidosis. Its tissues possess specialized chemical buffers that neutralize the toxic effects of the acid, allowing the muscle fibers to continue firing with explosive power long after a terrestrial mammal would be completely paralyzed. The lactic acid is simply trapped within the isolated muscles due to the intense vasoconstriction, kept far away from the brain and the circulating blood. It is only when the triumphant whale finally ascends, breaking the surface of the water and taking its first explosive breath, that the blood vessels dilate, the heart rate skyrockets, and the immense backlog of lactic acid is flushed out of the muscles and metabolized, while the myoglobin and hemoglobin batteries are simultaneously recharged for the next descent. Through the mastery of electrostatic protein engineering, extreme vascular triage, and profound acid tolerance, the sperm whale turns its own body into an unparalleled machine of metabolic efficiency. Yet, holding enough oxygen to survive the darkness is only half the battle. To reach the abyss without exhausting this precious energy supply, the whale must manipulate the very laws of fluid dynamics, requiring an anatomical structure so bizarre it defines the species, the Spermaceti organ. The colossal head of the sperm whale, which accounts for roughly 1/3 of its entire body length and a massive portion of its total weight, is not built to house an oversized brain. In fact, the brain of a sperm whale is located far back in the skull, completely isolated from the massive blunt structure that defines the front of the animal. Instead, the vast interior of the skull's asymmetrical basin is occupied by one of the most bizarre and highly specialized biological structures in the animal kingdom, the Spermaceti complex. When early whalers first carved into the heads of these leviathans, they discovered millions of liters of a thick, milky white substance. Due to its pearlescent, viscous appearance, they mistakenly believed they had tapped into the animal's reproductive reserves, naming the fluid Spermaceti, meaning the seed of the whale. This historical misunderstanding gave the species its common name. Modern biology, however, has revealed that this fluid has absolutely nothing to do with reproduction. It is a highly complex matrix of lipid liquids specifically composed of triglycerides and wax esters, encased within an incredibly tough, fibrous biological container. To understand the function of this massive organ, we must divide the whale's forehead into two distinct anatomical compartments. The uppermost section is known as the Spermaceti organ, often referred to by biologists simply as the case. This is a massive, elongated, barrel-shaped sac constructed from an incredibly dense and resilient connective tissue. Inside this fibrous barrel rests the bulk of the pure liquid spermaceti oil. Directly beneath the case, resting snugly inside the concave basin of the upper jaw, is a second lipid-filled structure known as the junk. The junk is not a single continuous sac like the case, but is instead partitioned into a series of distinct lens-shaped segments separated by thick walls of connective tissue. Both the case and the junk are heavily saturated with spermaceti oil, but they serve different, albeit interconnected, biomechanical and acoustic functions. While we will explore the acoustic properties of this complex later, its most immediate and fundamental physical function is to serve as the ultimate biological buoyancy engine, completely rewriting the rules of underwater locomotion. When any organism or submarine attempts to navigate the water column, it is constantly battling Archimedes' principle of buoyancy. This principle dictates that an object submerged in a fluid experiences an upward buoyant force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces. If the object is less dense than the surrounding water, it experiences positive buoyancy and floats to the surface. If it is more dense, it experiences negative buoyancy and sinks. If its density perfectly matches the surrounding water, it achieves neutral buoyancy, hovering weightlessly. For a surface-dwelling mammal that breathes air, the body is naturally buoyant due to the massive volume of gas in the lungs. Therefore, initiating a dive requires a tremendous amount of physical energy. The animal must vigorously flap its tail, physically fighting its own positive buoyancy to drive itself down into the depths. As we established in the previous section, the sperm whale operates on an incredibly strict energy budget. It has completely shut off its oxygen intake and is relying solely on the myoglobin batteries stored in its muscles. If a 50-ton sperm whale had to forcefully swim against its own natural buoyancy for the entirety of its descent to a depth of 2,000 meters, it would burn through its precious oxygen reserves before it even reached the hunting grounds. To conserve the energy required for the deep-sea battle, the whale must find a way to descend without swimming. It must find a way to turn itself into an anchor. This is the primary mechanical function of the spermaceti organ. The sperm whale manipulates the phase state of its internal wax to dynamically alter its own physical density. At the surface, when the whale is breathing and preparing for a dive, its core body temperature is maintained at roughly 37 degrees Celsius. At this warm mammalian temperature, the spermaceti wax inside the head is entirely in a liquid state. Liquid wax is relatively low in density, providing the massive animal with the immense positive buoyancy required to keep its blowhole safely above the ocean surface without expending any muscular effort to tread water. However, the whale cannot dive effectively in this highly buoyant state. To descend to the abyss, it must increase the specific gravity of its head, turning its buoyant balloon into a dense, heavy weight. To achieve this, the whale triggers a rapid, localized biological cooling system. The right nasal passage of the sperm whale, which, as we noted earlier, has been radically modified and separated from the blowhole, runs directly through the center of the massive spermaceti organ. When the whale decides to dive, it draws cold ocean water into this specialized nasal passage. By flushing freezing water directly into the core of its head, the whale initiates a massive thermal transfer. The heat from the liquid spermaceti oil is rapidly drawn out and absorbed by the cold seawater, which is then expelled or circulated. As the temperature of the spermaceti drops by merely a few degrees, an extraordinary physical transformation occurs. The complex wax esters inside the case undergo a thermodynamic phase change. They begin to crystallize and transition from a warm, low-density liquid oil into a cold, high-density solid wax. As the wax molecules crystallize and pack tightly together, the entire spermaceti organ physically shrinks in volume. Because the mass of the wax remains the same, but its volume has decreased, the overall density of the whale's head drastically increases. The massive head, which moments ago was a giant flotation device, suddenly becomes a biological anchor of solidified wax. This localized increase in density shifts the whale's center of gravity forward and plunges the animal into a state of negative buoyancy. The biomechanical advantage of this phase change is absolute. The whale simply points its heavy, solidifying head downward and stops swimming. It enters a state of perpetual, energy-free gliding. Gravity and the newly acquired negative buoyancy take over completely, dragging the 50-ton leviathan down into the abyss at a steady, controlled rate. During this long descent, the whale barely twitches a muscle. Its heart rate has plummeted, its blood flow is restricted, and its skeletal muscles are completely relaxed. Because it is sinking perfectly without effort, it conserves nearly 100% of the oxygen stored in its myoglobin batteries, reserving every single drop of metabolic energy for the violent, explosive confrontation with the giant squid waiting at the bottom of the ocean. After 90 minutes in the dark, the titanic battle concludes. The whale has consumed its prey, but its localized oxygen batteries are deeply depleted, and lactic acid is flooding its isolated muscle tissues. The survival clock is ticking violently. The whale must now ascend 2,000 meters back to the surface. However, it is currently in a state of severe negative buoyancy. Its head is filled with heavy crystallized wax, and the immense hydrostatic pressure of the deep ocean has further compressed its body. Swimming upward against this crushing weight, dragging a dense, solid anchor of wax through thousands of meters of water would require a catastrophic expenditure of energy that the exhausted whale simply does not possess. To survive the ascent, the whale must reverse the thermodynamic process. It must turn its biological anchor back into a hot air balloon. To melt the solid wax and restore positive buoyancy, the sperm whale initiates a massive, localized reheating protocol. While the cooling process relied on external seawater, the heating process relies entirely on the internal furnace of the whale's mammalian cardiovascular system. Surrounding the spermaceti organ and weaving through the fibrous walls of the case and the junk is an incredibly dense, highly complex network of blood vessels and capillary beds. During the descent and the hunt, these vessels were heavily constricted, minimizing blood flow to the head to conserve heat and oxygen. Now, ready to ascend, the autonomic nervous system triggers intense vasodilation in the head. The smooth muscles lining the arteries relax, and the whale's heart pumps a massive surge of superheated warm blood directly from the deep core of its body up into the dense capillary networks surrounding the spermaceti organ. This acts as a biological radiator. The intense mammalian body heat radiates from the rushing blood directly into the cold solid wax. The thermal energy breaks the crystalline bonds of the wax esters, causing a rapid phase transition from solid back to liquid. As the wax melts, it undergoes thermal expansion. The volume of the fluid increases, pushing outward against the fibrous case. This expansion in volume without any addition of mass dramatically decreases the overall density of the head. Within a remarkably short period of time, the specific gravity of the head drops below that of the surrounding cold, high-pressure seawater. The whale's entire body transitions from negative buoyancy to extreme positive buoyancy. Just as it used gravity to sink without effort, it now uses buoyancy to ascend without effort. The massive animal simply points its nose upward and allows the physical laws of fluid mechanics to carry it home. It floats rapidly and seamlessly toward the light, carried upward by its massive liquid-filled cranium. By the time it breaks the surface, the wax is fully liquefied, the lungs expand and clear the dead space, and the whale draws its first explosive breath of air, having conquered the abyss entirely through the masterful thermodynamic manipulation of its own biological density. Yet, This temperature-controlled buoyancy engine is merely the secondary function of the Spermaceti complex. The true, terrifying power of this giant reservoir of wax is revealed only when the whale enters the pitch-black darkness of the midnight zone, transforming this specialized buoyancy chamber into the most devastating biological acoustic weapon ever evolved on planet Earth. As the sperm whale breaches the threshold of the midnight zone, crossing into depths exceeding 1,000 meters, it enters an alien universe entirely devoid of solar radiation. In this abyssal environment, the visual cortex is rendered completely obsolete. Even the most highly evolved, light-sensitive eyes cannot pierce the absolute freezing darkness. For surface predators, blinding them effectively removes their ability to hunt, reducing them to desperate scavengers. The sperm whale, however, does not rely on photons to perceive its reality. It relies on the violent manipulation of mechanical pressure waves. To navigate the dark and hunt the most elusive giant prey on the planet, the whale has abandoned vision and weaponized sound, transforming its massive, oil-filled head into the most sophisticated biological sonar system ever to exist on Earth. To understand the sheer engineering brilliance of this acoustic weapon, we must first examine the physics of sound in a marine environment. In terrestrial environments, vision dominates because light travels effortlessly through the thin atmosphere, while sound dissipates relatively quickly. In the deep ocean, however, the physical rules are inverted. Water is incredibly dense, roughly 800 times denser than air. This immense density rapidly absorbs and scatters electromagnetic radiation, which is why the ocean is pitch black. However, this exact same density makes water an exceptionally efficient medium for transmitting mechanical energy. Sound travels through seawater at roughly 1,500 meters per second, which is nearly 4.5 times faster than it travels through the air at sea level. Furthermore, acoustic waves can propagate across vast oceanic distances with very little loss of energy. The sperm whale has harnessed this physical property of the ocean, evolving a pneumatic sound generation and amplification system that operates with the precision of a military-grade active sonar array. The creation of the sperm whale's sonar click does not originate in the vocal cords, as it does in most terrestrial mammals. In fact, the sperm whale does not even possess true functional vocal cords. Instead, the raw acoustic pulse is generated at the very front of the animal's massive head, utilizing a highly specialized, heavily modified nasal apparatus. As we discussed earlier, the sperm whale's right nasal passage is completely disconnected from the primary breathing function of the blowhole. It acts purely as a highly pressurized pneumatic tube. At the extreme anterior end of the whale's snout, just beneath the skin where this right nasal passage terminates, lies a bizarre, heavily muscled structure known biologically as the phonic lips. Historically, due to their strange, fleshy appearance, when dissected by early whalers, they were referred to as the museau de singe, or the monkey lips. The monkey lips are the engine of the sperm whale's acoustic arsenal. They consist of a pair of tight, incredibly tough cartilaginous flaps that act as a high-pressure biological valve. When the whale prepares to emit a sonar click, it forcefully pushes compressed air from its lungs up through the right nasal passage. This highly pressurized air is violently forced through the microscopic slit between the tightly closed monkey lips. As the air squeezes through, it causes the cartilaginous flaps to rapidly separate and violently slap back together. This pneumatic mechanical impact generates a sharp, broadband acoustic transient. In simple terms, it creates a loud, raw, mechanical click. However, generating sound at extreme depths presents a massive physical dilemma. If the whale were simply exhaling this pressurized air into the ocean, every time it made a click, it would rapidly deplete its finite oxygen supply and lose the structural volume needed to maintain its internal pneumatic pressure. The whale cannot afford to lose a single bubble of air during its 90-minute dive. Therefore, the acoustic system is designed as a completely closed, sealed pneumatic circuit. Immediately after the compressed air passes through the monkey lips and generates the click, it does not escape into the water. Instead, it is captured by an expandable biological balloon located just past the lips, known as the distal sac. From this sac, the air is meticulously funneled back down the left nasal passage, returning to the lungs and the internal reservoirs to be repressed and reused. The whale essentially juggles the same small volume of trapped air back and forth across its monkey lips, allowing it to generate thousands of deafening clicks without ever releasing a single breath into the surrounding ocean. Generating the raw click at the monkey lips is only the first step in this biomechanical process. An acoustic click generated at the extreme tip of the snout is naturally omnidirectional, meaning the sound waves scatter outward in all directions simultaneously. An omnidirectional sound is entirely useless for precision hunting. To target a giant squid thousands of meters away in the dark, the sound must be intensely focused and projected in a tight, highly directional beam. The whale must capture this raw acoustic energy and manipulate its trajectory. This is where the massive volume of liquid wax inside the head, which we previously identified as a buoyancy engine, reveals its true, terrifying primary function. It is a giant acoustic fluid dynamics laboratory. When the raw click is generated at the monkey lips, the acoustic wave does not travel forward into the water. Instead, the structural geometry of the surrounding tissues forces the sound wave to travel backward, deep into the massive barrel-shaped Spermaceti case. The liquid wax ester inside the case possesses a highly specific physical property known as acoustic impedance. Acoustic impedance is the resistance a medium offers to the propagation of a sound wave, determined by the density of the medium and the speed of sound within it. The acoustic impedance of the liquid Spermaceti wax is remarkably similar to the acoustic impedance of the surrounding seawater. This means that as the sound wave travels backward through the giant barrel of oil, it moves smoothly, maintaining its kinetic energy and raw power without dissipating. The sound wave races backward through the liquid wax at incredible speed until it reaches the posterior end of the Spermaceti organ, where it collides with the massive concave asymmetrical bony basin of the whale's skull. Resting directly between the back of the oil-filled case and the bone of the skull is another specialized anatomical structure known as the frontal sac. The frontal sac is a large, flat pocket tightly packed with compressed air. This trapped layer of air is the key to the entire acoustic mirror system. When the sound wave, traveling through the dense, heavy liquid wax, suddenly hits the thin, compressed air inside the frontal sac, it encounters an extreme acoustic impedance mismatch. Because the physical properties of heavy oil and thin gas are so radically different, the sound wave cannot penetrate the air sac. Instead, the laws of acoustic physics dictate that nearly 100% of the acoustic energy is violently reflected backward. The air sac acts as a perfect, impenetrable biological mirror for sound. Furthermore, because this air sac is pressed directly against the highly concave asymmetrical architecture of the skull itself functions exactly like a giant parabolic reflector dish. Just as a satellite dish captures scattered radio waves and bounces them toward a single focal point, the concave skull captures the raw, backward-travelling sound wave and perfectly reflects it forward, sending it hurtling back toward the front of the whale's head. The sound wave is now travelling forward, having been perfectly reflected by the biological parabolic mirror. However, while it is moving in the correct direction, the beam is still too broad and scattered to act as a precision targeting system. To narrow the beam into a devastating acoustic laser, the sound wave must pass through the lower compartment of the whale's forehead, the highly specialized lipid structure known as the junk. The junk is not merely a tub of fat. As we observed in the anatomical breakdown, the junk is meticulously partitioned into a series of distinct, lens-shaped segments separated by dense connective tissue. The chemical composition of the lipids within these segments is not uniform. The wax at the center of each lens has a slightly different density and acoustic impedance than the wax near the edges. This specific geometric and chemical arrangement is not accidental. The entire structure of the junk operates under the exact same physical principles as a convex glass lens used in a magnifying glass or a telescope, but instead of bending and focusing electromagnetic light waves, it bends and focuses mechanical sound waves. As the reflected acoustic pulse travels forward, it enters the junk. Because the speed of sound changes slightly as it passes through the varying densities of the lipid lenses, the outer edges of the sound wave are systematically bent inward toward the central axis. Lens after lens, the biological structure refracts the acoustic energy, continually narrowing and condensing the scattered sound wave. By the time the acoustic pulse finally exits the anterior end of the junk and breaches the skin of the whale's forehead, passing into the freezing ocean water, it has been radically transformed. It is no longer a raw, omnidirectional click. It has been pneumatically generated, bounced off a parabolic air mirror, and refracted through a massive biological acoustic lens. It emerges as a tightly focused, perfectly coherent, forward-facing beam of concussive acoustic energy. This focused beam can penetrate the dense, pitch-black water for miles, striking objects in the abyss and bouncing back to the whale's highly sensitive lower jaw, which acts as the receiver for the sonar echoes, painting a highly detailed, three-dimensional, high-resolution topographical map of the pitch-black environment directly into the whale's brain. The sperm whale's biological sonar is so precise that it can not only detect the exact distance, speed, and trajectory of a giant squid thousands of meters away, but it can also acoustically scan the internal anatomy of its prey, identifying the density of its soft tissues and the exact location of its hard, razor-sharp beak. Yet, this acoustic system is not merely an instrument of perception. By manipulating the sheer physical force of the air passing through the monkey lips, the sperm whale can elevate this echolocation beam from a sensory tool into a weapon of concussive biological destruction. Having meticulously engineered the raw acoustic pulse into a tightly focused, forward-facing beam of concussive energy, the sperm whale is now armed with a biological instrument of unparalleled power. However, to truly understand the devastating potential of this acoustic system, we must quantify the sheer physical force contained within a single click. In the realm of acoustics, sound intensity is measured using the decibel scale. It is crucial to understand that the decibel is not a linear measurement like inches or pounds. It is a logarithmic scale. This means that every increase of 10 decibels does not represent a steady incremental rise in volume, but rather a tenfold exponential increase in acoustic intensity. Furthermore, because water and air possess radically different densities, the reference points for measuring sound in these two mediums are fundamentally different. In the air, the standard reference pressure is 20 micropascals, while in the dense medium of the ocean, it is 1 micropascal. Therefore, comparing underwater decibels to airborne decibels requires a mathematical conversion. When acoustic biologists drop highly calibrated hydrophones into the deep ocean to measure the vocalizations of a hunting sperm whale, the readings they capture defy belief. The tightly focused acoustic beam emitted from the front of the whale's head can reach a staggering intensity of 230 to 236 decibels in water. To put this apocalyptic level of sound into perspective, we must translate it into an airborne equivalent. A level of 230 decibels underwater translates roughly to 170 to 174 decibels in the open air. This is significantly louder than a jet engine at takeoff from 100 feet away, louder than the deafening roar of a heavy artillery cannon, and approaches the acoustic threshold of a literal rocket launch. It is, without a doubt, the single loudest sound produced by any living biological organism on the planet. But at these extreme decibel levels, sound ceases to be something you merely hear. It becomes a violent physical event. His sound wave is, at its core, a propagating wave of mechanical pressure moving through a medium. When an acoustic pulse reaches 230 decibels, the wavefront carries an immense amount of kinetic energy and hydrostatic pressure. If a human diver were somehow suspended directly in front of a sperm whale when it unleashed a full power click, The result would not merely be ruptured eardrums or profound deafness. The sheer concussive force of the pressure wave slamming into the human body could cause severe internal trauma, violently compressing and expanding air-filled cavities, bruising organs, and potentially inducing lethal neurological shock. This begs a fundamental evolutionary question. If the sperm whale's primary goal is merely echolocation, painting a topographical map of the abyss, why would it evolve the capacity to generate an acoustic pulse of such cataclysmic intensity? Dolphins and bats navigate perfectly, using ultrasonic clicks that are a tiny fraction of this power. The extreme biological expenditure required to generate a 230 decibel blast suggests that echolocation is only the secondary function of this beam. The primary function, according to a highly compelling and heavily debated paradigm in marine biology, known as the acoustic stunning hypothesis, is offensive weaponization. The sperm whale does not just use sound to see the giant squid. It uses sound to physically destroy its capacity to fight back. The prey of the sperm whale, primarily the giant squid and the colossal squid, are not helpless targets. They are massive, incredibly aggressive invertebrates armed with razor-sharp parrot-like beaks and tentacles, lined with hundreds of serrated suckers and rotating hooks. In the freezing water of the midnight zone, a squid is highly agile, capable of utilizing rapid jet propulsion to execute violent evasive maneuvers. As we established earlier, the sperm whale is operating under extreme physiological constraints. It is holding its breath, its heart rate has plummeted to a few beats per minute, and its swimming muscles are cut off from the main blood supply. If the massive lumbering whale had to engage in an extended high-speed, acrobatic chase to catch a highly maneuverable squid, it would rapidly burn through its localized oxygen batteries and risk drowning in the abyss. To survive, the whale must neutralize the squid's mobility before the physical confrontation even begins. It needs a long-range biological sniper rifle. The acoustic stunning hypothesis posits that as the sperm whale detects the squid from a distance, it locks onto its target and unleashes a rapid fire barrage of maximum intensity clicks. But how exactly does sound stun an invertebrate? When explosive sound waves are used to kill or stun fish, the mechanism of injury is usually the catastrophic rupture of the fish's swim bladder. The sudden, immense pressure wave causes the gas inside the bladder to compress and expand violently, tearing the surrounding tissue and causing lethal internal hemorrhaging. The giant squid, however, presents a complex biomechanical problem. It does not possess a swim bladder. It has no internal pockets of compressible gas. Its body is composed entirely of dense muscle, cartilage and fluid, primarily water, and high concentrations of ammonium chloride, which it uses for its own neutral buoyancy. Because the physical density of the squid's body is nearly identical to the density of the surrounding seawater, they possess matching acoustic impedance. Theoretically, an incoming sound wave should pass right through the squid's gelatinous tissue without transferring its destructive kinetic energy, much like light passing cleanly through a pane of clear glass. However, biological organisms are not homogeneous blocks of water. While the squid lacks gas cavities, it possesses an incredibly complex and highly sensitive neurological and sensory infrastructure. The primary target of the sperm whale's acoustic weapon is not the squid's flesh, but its delicate statocysts. The statocysts are essentially the invertebrate equivalent of the inner ear. They are small, spherical, fluid-filled chambers located inside the squid's cartilaginous skull. Inside these chambers are microscopic, dense, mineralized stones known as statoliths, which rest against beds of highly sensitive hair cells. As the squid moves, accelerates, or changes direction, the statoliths shift, stimulating the hair cells and providing the squid's brain with crucial data regarding gravity, balance, and spatial orientation. When the sperm whale fires its 230 decibel acoustic beam directly at the squid, the massive wave of hydrostatic pressure slams into the animal. While the wave may pass harmlessly through the outer mantle muscle, when it impacts the statocysts, the results are catastrophic. The extreme pressure differential causes the fluid inside the sensory chambers to violently oscillate. The heavy statoliths are thrown violently against the delicate hair cells, overloading them with millions of chaotic sensory signals. This acoustic bombardment causes a massive instantaneous sensory failure. The squid experiences extreme vertigo and complete spatial disorientation. It loses its ability to determine up from down, left from right. In a matter of milliseconds, its sophisticated jet propulsion system becomes useless because the brain can no longer coordinate the direction of the escape. Furthermore, the concussive force of the acoustic beam may directly interact with the squid's central nervous system. Squids possess some of the largest individual nerve fibers in the animal kingdom, known as giant axons, which control their rapid escape responses. Biomechanical physicists theorize that the sheer physical pressure of a highly focused acoustic wavefront, moving at 1,500 meters per second, could be strong enough to forcefully alter the permeability of the nerve cell membranes. The mechanical shock wave physically squeezes the axons, causing an involuntary and massive influx of sodium ions, which forcibly depolarizes the nerve fibers. This would result in a massive involuntary misfire of the squid's entire nervous system. Under the onslaught of this acoustic bombardment, the squid does not necessarily die, but it is rendered completely neurologically paralyzed. Its tentacles freeze, its mantle spasms, and it hangs suspended and helpless in the pitch-black water. This theory perfectly explains a biological anomaly that has baffled marine biologists for decades. When the stomachs of dead sperm whales are examined, researchers frequently find the remains of giant squids, including perfectly intact, massive specimens. Alarmingly, these squids rarely show signs of being violently bitten in half or shredded by the whale's teeth prior to ingestion. The evidence strongly suggests that the whales are swallowing these massive, dangerous predators entirely whole. It is highly improbable that an active, healthy giant squid would allow itself to be swallowed whole without inflicting massive structural damage to the inside of the whale's mouth and throat. The only logical explanation is that by the time the whale's jaws close over the squid, the prey is already entirely incapacitated. The sequence of the deep-sea hunt is a terrifying display of biological warfare. The sperm whale, having descended thousands of meters in absolute silence to conserve its oxygen, reaches the midnight zone. It begins to scan the abyss, emitting slow, methodical clicks that bounce off the deep-sea terrain. Suddenly an echo returns, revealing the soft, dense mass of a giant squid hovering in the dark a mile away. The whale alters its pitch and trajectory, pointing its massive asymmetrical skull directly at the target. It engages the biological parabolic mirror and the acoustic lipid lenses of the Spermaceti organ. As it closes the distance, the slow clicks rapidly accelerate, turning into a high frequency, deafening buzz known to researchers as a creak. The whale is effectively locking on and opening fire. A continuous barrage of 230 decibel shockwaves rips through the freezing water, bridging the physical gap between the two titans. The invisible acoustic beam strikes the squid, scrambling its statocysts and forcefully depolarizing its giant axons. The squid, stripped of its sensory perception and paralyzed by neurological misfires, is trapped in an acoustic stun lock. The massive, silent shadow of the whale glides out of the darkness, its jaw dropping open, ready to engulf the stunned leviathan without needing to expend its precious oxygen reserves in a prolonged physical struggle. The biological acoustic weapon has not just located the prey, it has won the battle before physical contact is even made. Yet, even with the prey stunned, the anatomical mechanics of consuming a creature as large as a giant squid require a heavily specialized jaw structure, bringing us to the biomechanics of the bite itself. To truly appreciate the evolutionary triumph of the sperm whale's biological weaponry, we must thoroughly examine the terrifying complexity of the prey it is designed to hunt. The abyss is not populated by passive victims waiting to be consumed, It is a hostile, extreme ecosystem that breeds radical biological adaptations. In the freezing, high-pressure void of the bathypelagic zone, the sperm whale seeks out the undisputed rulers of the invertebrate world, Architeuthis ducks, the giant squid, and its even more massive relative, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni, the colossal squid. For centuries these creatures existed only in the realm of maritime mythology, described by terrified sailors as sea monsters capable of dragging entire ships beneath the waves. Modern marine biology, however, has stripped away the mythology to reveal an anatomical reality that is arguably more fascinating and deadly than the legends themselves. The giant squid and the colossal squid are marvels of deep-sea biomechanics, representing the absolute physical limits of invertebrate evolution. When discussing these animals, it is crucial to separate scientific measurement from exaggerated folklore. A fully grown female giant squid can reach an astonishing length of 12 to 13 meters from the tip of its mantle to the ends of its two longest feeding tentacles. However, length alone is a deceptive metric. The majority of this length is comprised of the incredibly thin, whip-like tentacles. The central body of the animal, known as the mantle, is a thick, highly muscular conical tube that typically measures about 2 to 3 meters in length. Inside this muscular cloak lies the squid's highly efficient closed circulatory system, powered by 3 distinct hearts pumping blue, copper-based blood. The mantle is not merely a protective shell for the internal organs, it is the primary engine of the squid's locomotion. Unlike the sperm whale, which relies on the steady rhythmic undulation of its massive tail flukes, the squid moves through the water utilizing a highly sophisticated biological jet propulsion system. The squid draws a massive volume of cold ocean water into the open cavity of its mantle. Once the mantle is fully expanded and filled with water, the thick circular muscle fibers composing the mantle wall contract with explosive unified force. This violent muscular contraction seals the mantle opening and violently forces the trapped water out through a highly flexible, highly directional biological nozzle called the siphon, or funnel. By rapidly altering the angle of the siphon, the squid can execute instantaneous, unpredictable changes in direction, launching itself backward into the darkness at incredible speeds to evade the acoustic lock of the descending whale. However, continuous jet propulsion is highly energy intensive, and the deep ocean is an environment defined by extreme caloric scarcity. Like the sperm whale, the squid must find a way to maintain its position in the water column without constantly expending muscular energy fighting against gravity. The sperm whale achieves this through the thermodynamic manipulation of Spermaceti wax, but the giant squid relies on a radical strategy of biochemical substitution. The flesh of the giant squid is heavily saturated with a chemical compound known as ammonium chloride. In the precise physiological concentrations found within the squid's muscle tissues, this ammonium solution is slightly less dense than the surrounding high-pressure seawater. By accumulating massive quantities of ammonium chloride uniformly throughout its body, the squid achieves perfect neutral buoyancy. It literally turns its entire muscular structure into a chemical flotation device, allowing the massive invertebrate to hover weightlessly and silently in the pitch-black abyss, expending zero energy as it waits to ambush its own prey. This extreme chemical adaptation is incredibly effective for survival, but it comes with a bizarre side effect. The overwhelming presence of ammonia renders the flesh of the giant squid incredibly toxic and overwhelmingly bitter to the taste buds of almost all surface predators, including humans. Yet, the sperm whale's digestive system has evolved to completely ignore this extreme chemical toxicity, processing the ammonia-soaked flesh with ruthless efficiency. While the sperm whale relies on acoustic pulses to map the darkness, the giant squid relies on the most extreme visual hardware on the planet to detect incoming threats. The eyes of the giant squid are undeniably the largest in the entire animal kingdom, reaching up to 27 centimeters in diameter, which is roughly the size of a standard dinner plate. In an environment devoid of sunlight, evolving a massive eye might seem like an evolutionary misstep. However, the squid is not looking for sunlight. It is scanning the dark for bioluminescence. When a massive 50-ton sperm whale moves aggressively through the deep ocean, the sheer physical displacement of the water violently disturbs millions of microscopic bioluminescent plankton and jellies. This mechanical disturbance causes the plankton to emit faint flashes of blue light. The squid's massive hypersensitive pupil acts as a biological light vacuum, capable of detecting this faint glowing silhouette of disturbed water from over 100 meters away. The giant eye provides the squid with a critical early visual warning system, allowing it to perceive the ghostly outline of the approaching leviathan just moments before the whale's concussive acoustic beam strikes. If the squid survives the initial acoustic bombardment and the encounter devolves into a close-quarters physical struggle, the true horror of its anatomy is unleashed. The squid's primary weapons are its 10 appendages attached directly to its head. 8 of these are thick, powerful arms used for grappling and holding prey. The remaining 2 are the feeding tentacles, which are massively elongated, highly elastic structures that can be shot forward with the speed of a harpoon. These appendages are constructed entirely of specialized tissue known as muscular hydrostats. Much like an elephant's trunk or a human tongue, a muscular hydrostat contains no bones or rigid skeletal support. Instead, it relies on the complex, tight weaving of a longitudinal, transverse and helical muscle fibers, compressing against the incompressible fluids within the tissue itself. This structural design grants the tentacles unlimited degrees of freedom, allowing them to bend, twist, elongate, and forcefully constrict around a target with terrifying mechanical strength. The inner surface of these arms is lined with hundreds of tightly packed suction cups. But these are not the gentle, rubbery suction cups found on an octopus. The suckers of the giant squid are biological chainsaws. Each individual suction cup is reinforced with a rigid, razor-sharp, serrated ring made of hard chitin. When the squid's tentacle wraps around a surface, the muscular piston inside the sucker pulls back, creating a powerful vacuum seal. Simultaneously, the serrated chitinous teeth are driven violently into the flesh of the target. If the prey struggles and attempts to pull away, the serrated rings dig deeper, ripping and shearing the tissue. In the case of the colossal squid, the weaponry is upgraded to an even more lethal standard. Many of its suction cups are completely replaced by large, incredibly sharp chitinous hooks. Some of these hooks are rigidly fixed, while others are mounted on mobile bases, allowing them to swivel 360 degrees. When these swiveling hooks sink into the thick blubber of a sperm whale, they lock into the flesh like deeply embedded meat hooks, making them almost impossible to dislodge without tearing away massive chunks of tissue. At the very center of this writhing, serrated array of tentacles lies the squid's ultimate weapon of consumption, the beak. Hidden deep within a massive sphere of muscle known as the buccal mass, the squid possesses a large, incredibly powerful beak that visually resembles the beak of a giant parrot. This structure is composed of a heavily cross-linked matrix of chitin and tough proteins, transitioning from a slightly flexible base to an intensely hard, razor-sharp tip. The biomechanics of the beak are highly unusual because, lacking a skeletal skull, the beak has no bone to anchor against. The intense mechanical force required to shear through flesh is generated entirely by the dense surrounding buccal mass wrapping around it. When the giant squid uses its serrated tentacles to forcefully drag its prey into the center of its arms, the massive beak engages, capable of slicing cleanly through solid bone and thick muscle. Furthermore, housed just inside the beak is the radula, a conveyor belt like ribbon of tough tissue lined with rows of microscopic backward-pointing teeth. As the beak slices the meat, the radula acts like a biological rasp, shredding the chunks of flesh and dragging them down into the digestive tract. Bizarrely, due to the highly compact nature of cephalopod anatomy, the squid's esophagus passes directly through the dead centre of its donut-shaped brain. If the squid were to swallow a piece of prey that was not completely shredded by the beak and the radula, the expanding chunk of meat passing through the esophagus would physically expand and cause catastrophic, lethal brain damage. Therefore, the beak must be an instrument of absolute precise destruction. This is the nightmare that the sperm whale seeks out in the absolute darkness. An animal saturated in toxic ammonia, armed with eyes the size of plates, 8 arms lined with serrated circular saws, 2 elastic harpoons embedded with rotating hooks, and a razor-sharp, crushing beak. The clash between these two highly specialized titans in the Midnight Zone is not a simple predator catching helpless prey. It is an extreme biomechanical war between the most advanced acoustic mammalian weapon on Earth and the most heavily armed, rapidly maneuvering invertebrate in the history of the ocean. The evidence of these violent deep-sea battles is written directly into the flesh of the whales, revealing a complex dynamic of attack and consumption that requires a massive evolutionary redesign of the mammalian jaw. The sheer violence of the clash between the sperm whale and the giant squid in the absolute darkness of the Midnight Zone is rarely witnessed by human eyes, but the brutal mechanics of these encounters are recorded in permanent biological ledgers. The primary evidence of this deep-sea warfare is written directly into the heavily scarred skin of the sperm whales themselves. When these massive mammalian predators ascend to the surface, their enormous blunt heads are frequently completely covered in a chaotic matrix of deep, circular lacerations and jagged, parallel scratch marks. For decades, these intricate battle scars were the only physical proof marine biologists had that the giant squid was not merely a passive scavenger, but an incredibly heavily armed and aggressive combatant capable of engaging in close quarters combat with a 50-ton leviathan. To decipher these scars is to reverse engineer the biomechanics of the struggle. The distinct circular marks, which often resemble brandings burned into the thick blubber, are the direct result of the squid's chitinous serrated suction cups. If the sperm whale's acoustic, stunning blast fails to completely paralyze the invertebrate, or if the squid manages a desperate autonomic reflexive strike before being fully incapacitated, it immediately deploys its muscular hydrostats. The squid's primary defensive strategy is not to attack the whale's heavily armoured flanks, but to fiercely wrap its massive arms and tentacles directly around the whale's face, specifically targeting the soft, fleshy regions surrounding the monkey lips and the massive spermaceti organ. As the heavily muscled arms constrict, the biological pistons inside hundreds of suction cups engage, pulling a powerful vacuum while simultaneously driving their razor-sharp, serrated chitinous rings deep into the whale's dermis. When the colossal squid is the target, the physical evidence becomes even more gruesome. Instead of merely leaving circular serration marks, the swivelling, deeply embedded chitinous hooks of the colossal squid tear long, deep trenches through the whale's flesh as the squid violently struggles to pull itself free from the whale's incoming jaw. Historically, the sheer size of these circular scars led to wildly inaccurate calculations regarding the maximum size of the giant squid. Early researchers discovered sucker scars on older sperm whales that were several inches in diameter, leading to the terrifying but mathematically flawed conclusion that the ocean harboured squids well over 100 feet long. However, modern biomechanical analysis and cellular biology have debunked this myth. The skin of a sperm whale does not replace itself in the same manner as human skin. It stretches and expands as the animal grows. A deep sucker scar inflicted upon a juvenile sperm whale by a standard-sized giant squid will physically expand and scale upward as the whale grows into adulthood, creating the illusion of an impossibly massive attacker. While the squid desperately rakes its serrated arms across the whale's face, attempting to maneuver its massive razor-sharp beak into a position where it can gouge the whale's vital sensory organs, the whale is preparing to execute the final lethal maneuver of the hunt. It is here that we encounter one of the most profound anatomical paradoxes in the mammalian kingdom. When we examine the evolutionary blueprints of almost all apex terrestrial and marine predators, from the great white shark to the terrestrial lion to the closely related killer whale, we see a heavy reliance on massive interlocking jaws. These jaws are typically armed with upper and lower sets of highly specialized teeth designed to violently shear flesh, crush heavy bone, and tear massive prey into easily digestible pieces. The sperm whale, despite hunting some of the largest and most dangerous prey on Earth, completely abandons this evolutionary standard. If you examine the skeletal structure of a sperm whale's skull, the upper jaw is entirely devoid of functional teeth. The vast, flat expanse of the upper palate is heavily keratinized and completely smooth, featuring only a series of deep, fleshy, recessed sockets. The lower jaw, known as the mandible, is equally bizarre. Known anatomically as the mandibular symphysis, the two halves of the lower jawbone are fused together in an incredibly narrow, elongated V shape, resembling a pair of massive, heavy bone chopsticks rather than a traditional wide mammalian jaw. Lined along this remarkably narrow lower mandible are approximately 20 to 26 pairs of massive, heavy, conical teeth. These teeth, which can weigh over 2 pounds each, are blunt and relatively uniform in shape. This highly asymmetrical and seemingly inefficient dental arrangement raises a fundamental biomechanical question. How does a predator consume a fiercely struggling, highly rubbery, 400-pound invertebrate utilizing a jaw that cannot chew, cannot shear, and only has teeth on the bottom? The answer lies in the physics of fluid dynamics and a highly specialized feeding mechanism known as suction feeding. The sperm whale does not use its massive teeth to bite the giant squid to death. In fact, marine biologists have documented numerous healthy, well-nourished adult sperm whales that had completely deformed lower jaws or were missing all of their teeth entirely, yet their stomachs were still completely full of giant squids. This proves conclusively that the teeth are entirely secondary to the actual mechanism of ingestion. When the massive conical teeth of the lower jaw do engage, they are not functioning as knives. They are functioning as biological gripping spikes. As the whale closes the distance on the stunned or struggling squid, it drops its narrow lower jaw. The teeth sink into the slick, gelatinous mantle of the squid. As the jaw closes, the blunt lower teeth fit perfectly into the empty, fleshy sockets of the toothless upper palate, essentially creating a heavily locked biological cage. This traps the slick, writhing mass of the squid, preventing it from utilizing its jet propulsion to escape. The teeth serve only to secure the heavy payload. The true mechanism of consumption requires the whale to manipulate the hydrostatic pressure of the surrounding ocean. To swallow a massive, intact giant squid without chewing requires a sudden and violent expansion of the whale's internal pharyngeal volume. At the base of the whale's throat lies a massive, highly articulated hyoid bone complex, which serves as the anchor point for a heavily muscled, incredibly powerful tongue. Once the squid is positioned directly in front of the mouth or loosely gripped by the lower teeth, the sperm whale executes a rapid, immensely powerful muscular contraction. It violently retracts its massive tongue deep into its throat, while simultaneously depressing the entire hyoid apparatus downward and backward. According to the fundamental principles of fluid dynamics and Boyle's law, when the volume of a sealed chamber rapidly increases, the internal pressure within that chamber exponentially drops. By violently expanding the physical space inside its massive oral cavity and throat, the sperm whale instantly creates a massive localized void of negative pressure. It essentially turns its mouth into a colossal, biological vacuum chamber. The surrounding seawater of the midnight zone, which is already under immense positive hydrostatic pressure at a depth of 2,000 meters, violently rushes inward to fill this sudden low-pressure void. The resulting inward surge of water is catastrophic. The giant squid, whether it is partially stunned by the acoustic blast or desperately clinging to the whale's face with its serrated suckers, is caught directly in this unstoppable hydrodynamic undertow. The immense force of the rushing water rips the squid's tentacles away from the whale's skin and physically folds the invertebrate's rubbery body inward. The squid is quite literally inhaled. It completely bypasses the gripping teeth and is sucked whole, head first or tail first, directly down the whale's massively expandable esophagus. This extreme suction feeding mechanism perfectly explains why the heavily armoured beaks of the giant squid are almost never found with bite marks or structural damage. The prey transitions from hovering in the open ocean to plunging deep into the whale's multi-chambered stomach in a matter of seconds, driven entirely by the manipulation of water pressure. Inside the massive muscular first chamber of the whale's stomach, the highly toxic ammonia-soaked flesh of the giant squid will finally be crushed and broken down by strong muscular contractions and concentrated gastric acids, leaving only the indestructible razor-sharp chitinous beaks behind as the indigestible remnants of the deep-sea war. Through the perfection of this hydrodynamic suction, the sperm whale bypasses the need for complex shearing jaws, utilising the very pressure of the ocean itself as the final mechanism to consume its monstrous prey. Yet, to understand how a terrestrial mammal evolved into this perfectly adapted toothless deep-sea acoustic vacuum, we must trace its genetic lineage back through millions of years of evolutionary history, leaving the midnight zone and returning to the sunlit shores of a prehistoric Earth. To fully comprehend the sheer biomechanical supremacy of the modern sperm whale, we must abandon the freezing depths of the midnight zone and travel back through the geological strata, reversing the clock by approximately 50 million years. The evolutionary history of the sperm whale is not a linear tale of a fish simply growing larger over time. It is a profound biological paradox. It is the story of a terrestrial mammal, breathing atmospheric air and walking on four legs, that willfully abandoned the sunlit continents to plunge back into the primordial ocean, ultimately engineering itself to conquer the most hostile environment on the planet. This evolutionary journey from the terrestrial dirt to the abyssal depths represents one of the most radical physiological transformations in the history of vertebrate paleontology. The fossil record dictates that the ancestors of all modern cetaceans, including dolphins, baleen whales, and the sperm whale, were artiodactyls, even toed ungulates closely related to modern hippopotamuses, deer, and pigs. The earliest known representative of this lineage is Pachycetus, a creature that lived during the early Eocene epoch. Pachycetus did not look like a whale. It was a carnivorous, four-legged, wolf-like predator with hooves, hunting along the margins of shallow freshwater streams and estuaries in what is now the modern Indian subcontinent. However, subtle anatomical clues within the skull of Pachycetus, specifically the highly dense thickened bone surrounding its middle ear structure known as the involucrum, revealed its true evolutionary destiny. This dense ear bone was the very first rudimentary adaptation for hearing underwater, the evolutionary seed that would eventually blossom into the sperm whale's devastating 230 decibel acoustic weaponry. Over the next 10 million years, a rapid and dramatic sequence of anatomical modifications occurred as these terrestrial predators committed entirely to a marine lifestyle. Species like Ambulocetus, often dubbed the walking whale, adapted webbed feet and a powerful undulating spine to swim through coastal waters while still possessing the ability to drag itself onto land. By the late Eocene epoch, the transition was essentially complete. Creatures like Basilosaurus patrolled the ancient seas. Basilosaurus was a massive serpentine marine predator that had completely severed its ties to the land. Its hind limbs had shrunk to useless vestigial appendages, its forelimbs had transformed into highly efficient hydrodynamic flippers, and its nostrils had begun the slow evolutionary migration from the tip of its snout toward the top of its skull, acting as the precursor to the modern blowhole. However, these ancient whales were still primarily visual predators, hunting fish and smaller marine mammals in the warm, sunlit shallow seas. The true evolutionary divergence that would ultimately forge the sperm whale occurred much later, during the Oligocene epoch, approximately 34 million years ago. As global climates shifted and the ocean currents radically reorganized, the ancestral cetacean lineage split into two distinct factions. One branch, the Mysticeti, abandoned teeth entirely in favor of baleen plates, evolving to filter vast quantities of microscopic zooplankton from the surface waters. The other branch, the Odontoceti, or toothed whales, retained their teeth and embarked on a radically different evolutionary trajectory, the pursuit of single, large prey items. It was within this toothed lineage that the very first primitive echolocation systems evolved, initially allowing them to navigate and hunt in murky, dark coastal waters. Yet the ancestral sperm whales of the Miocene epoch, roughly 15 million years ago, did not resemble the deep-diving, squid-hunting leviathans we know today. The fossil record of the Miocene paints a terrifying picture of the ocean surface layer. This was the era of the macroraptorial sperm whales. The most infamous and horrifying of these ancient titans was Leviathan melville. Leviathan was a monster of unprecedented proportions, matching the modern sperm whale in size, reaching estimated lengths of up to 17 metres. But unlike its modern descendant, Leviathan possessed a highly symmetrical skull and a massive, heavily armoured jaw, equipped with thick, deeply rooted teeth on both the top and the bottom. These teeth were among the largest of any known vertebrate, measuring over 36 centimetres in length and nearly 12 centimetres in diameter. Leviathan melville was not plunging into the dark to suck up squids. It was a hypercarnivorous apex predator that ruled the surface waters, using its colossal, interlocking jaws to violently bite massive chunks of flesh out of other, smaller baleen whales. Its skull possessed a smaller, primitive Spermaceti organ, likely used for amplifying its vocalizations to coordinate hunts, or for structural reinforcement when ramming massive prey at high speeds. For millions of years, these macroraptorial sperm whales dominated the shallow seas, sitting at the very pinnacle of the global marine food web. Why, then, did the evolutionary lineage that led to the modern sperm whale, Physeter macrocephalus, entirely abandon this dominant surface lifestyle, lose its massive upper teeth, and flee into the crushing darkness of the abyss? The answer lies in the unforgiving mechanics of ecological competition and global climate change. As the Miocene epoch transitioned into the Pliocene, the oceans became an incredibly crowded and dangerous battlefield for apex predators. The macroraptorial sperm whales were no longer alone at the top of the food chain. They were forced to compete directly for the same mammalian prey with two emerging biological nightmares. The first was Otodus megalodon, arguably the largest and most powerful predatory shark to ever exist, a massive leviathan armed with rows of thick serrated teeth designed exclusively for crushing bone and shearing whale blubber. The second threat was the rapid evolution of early delphinids, the highly intelligent ancestors of the modern killer whale. While individually smaller than Leviathan, these early orcas hunted in highly coordinated, fast-moving pods, easily outcompeting the larger, more solitary sperm whales for the rapidly dwindling surface prey. Simultaneously, the global climate was undergoing a massive, severe cooling phase. The ocean temperatures plummeted, causing a drastic drop in the populations of the small baleen whales that Leviathan and Megalodon relied upon for caloric survival. The surface waters were rapidly becoming a theatre of starvation and deadly competition. Faced with the imminent threat of extinction, the ancestors of the modern sperm whale faced a brutal evolutionary ultimatum: stay at the surface and fight a losing war of attrition against the megalodon and the killer whales, or find a new, completely unexploited ecological niche where no other apex predator could possibly follow. Deep beneath the chaotic competitive surface, the bathypelagic and abyssopelagic zones offered a massive, virtually limitless food source: the giant cephalopods. The sheer biomass of deep-sea squid in the world's oceans is mathematically staggering, representing hundreds of millions of tons of highly nutritious protein. However, this vast biological goldmine was locked safely behind an impenetrable environmental fortress of freezing temperatures, absolute darkness, and crushing hydrostatic pressure. No surface predator could survive the descent, let alone hunt effectively in the pitch-black void. The ancestral lineage of Physeter macrocephalus began a radical biological pivot to exploit this untouched resource. Evolution is relentlessly driven by natural selection, and those ancient sperm whales that possess slightly larger spermaceti organs, allowing them to dive slightly deeper and access deeper squid populations, survived the surface famines. Over millions of years, this extreme selective pressure drove the species to an anatomical absolute. The massive upper teeth, which were essential for tearing whale blubber but completely useless for catching slippery rubbery squid, were gradually selected out of the gene pool entirely, leaving only the empty, fleshy upper sockets. The lower jaw narrowed into the specialized, structurally reinforced gripping tool required for high-speed suction feeding. The skull heavily telescoped and became wildly asymmetrical to physically support an increasingly massive spermaceti organ, perfectly tuned by evolution to operate as a thermodynamic buoyancy engine and a parabolic acoustic mirror. The respiratory and circulatory systems were completely re-engineered, allowing the lungs to collapse safely without tearing, while the deep muscle tissues became hypersaturated with positively charged myoglobin proteins to store the immense reserves of oxygen needed for prolonged combat in the dark. The evolutionary gamble was an absolute triumph of biological engineering. While the terrifying leviathan Melville and the massive megalodon ultimately went extinct, completely unable to adapt their highly specialized surface biology to the vanishing prey and the freezing climate, the physically bizarre, toothless, asymmetrical descendant thrived. By abandoning the light, the modern sperm whale bypassed the entire competitive structure of the ocean's surface layer. It engineered itself to cross the physiological boundaries of mammalian existence, descending voluntarily into the crushing, freezing dark to claim a massive, highly toxic invertebrate food source that no other animal on Earth could touch. It traded the heavy armor and the giant teeth of a surface brawler for the acoustic lasers and the pressure-resistant physiology of a deep-sea sniper. Today, the sperm whale has no true rivals in the midnight zone. It exists in an evolutionary class entirely its own, a testament to the sheer adaptive power of mammalian biology when pushed to the absolute limits of survival. Yet, this physiological isolation in the deep ocean does not mean the sperm whale is a solitary, unthinking biological machine. Behind the massive acoustic weapon and the heavily scarred face lies the largest, most neurologically complex brain ever to evolve on planet Earth, an organ that drives a highly sophisticated acoustic language and a deeply bonded matriarchal society. Beneath the massive acoustic weaponry and the thermodynamic buoyancy engines of the Spermaceti organ, safely isolated in the heavily reinforced posterior basin of the asymmetrical skull, lies the ultimate command center of this biological submarine. While the physical adaptations of the sperm whale are engineered to conquer the crushing hydrostatic pressure and the freezing darkness of the midnight zone, it is the neurological hardware driving these systems that truly separates the sperm whale from a mere biological machine. The sperm whale possesses the largest and heaviest brain of any known animal, living or extinct. Weighing in at an astounding 8 kilograms, or nearly 18 pounds, this colossal organ is more than 5 times heavier than a human brain. However, in the field of neurobiology, absolute mass is not the sole indicator of cognitive capacity. To understand the profound intelligence of the sperm whale, we must examine the extreme microarchitecture and the cellular complexity of its cerebral cortex. When neuroscientists dissect the brain of a sperm whale, they are confronted with a level of cortical folding, known as gyrification, that far exceeds that of the human brain. The neocortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for higher-order thinking, sensory perception and conscious thought, is so intensely wrinkled and deeply fissured that its total surface area is mathematically staggering. This massive expansion of the neocortex is primarily driven by the sheer computational power required to process the whale's 230 decibel acoustic sonar. While human brains dedicate massive neural real estate to the visual cortex, processing millions of photons to create a continuous image of our surroundings, the sperm whale's brain is heavily specialized for auditory processing. It must continuously calculate the precise time delays, frequency shifts, and amplitude changes of thousands of returning sonar echoes, instantly rendering a high-resolution, three-dimensional topographical map of the pitch-black abyss. It is simultaneously calculating the speed, trajectory, and biological density of a giant squid, while monitoring its own internal oxygen levels and maintaining complex thermodynamic control of its head. Yet, this massive brain is not merely an acoustic calculator. Deep within the architecture of the whale's cortex, researchers have discovered massive clusters of highly specialized nerve cells, known as von Economo neurons, or spindle neurons. For decades, evolutionary biologists believed that spindle neurons were entirely exclusive to the great apes and humans, acting as the neurological foundation for our own advanced social behaviors. These elongated, highly interconnected cells are the biological circuitry responsible for processing complex social emotions, empathy, grief, intuition, and highly coordinated group dynamics. The fact that sperm whales possess these identical neurons, and in quantities that rival or exceed our own, implies a level of emotional and social depth that is almost incomprehensible to terrestrial observers. The sperm whale is not a solitary monster wandering the dark. It is a highly self-aware, deeply emotional entity, inextricably linked to a complex global society. Because the sperm whale operates in an ocean where visual contact is practically impossible over long distances, this advanced social intelligence cannot be expressed through body language or facial expressions. Instead, their social bonds are maintained entirely through an incredibly sophisticated acoustic language. When sperm whales are not hunting in the deep, they transition from emitting the rapid, continuous echolocation clicks used to track squid to generating highly structured rhythmic sequences of clicks, known to marine biologists as codas. If the hunting clicks are the whale's biological radar, the codas are its voice. Codas sound remarkably like the rhythmic tapping of a complex Morse code. A single coda might consist of 3 rapid clicks, a pause, and then 2 slower clicks, while another might be a continuous, evenly spaced sequence of 5 clicks. For decades, researchers assumed these acoustic patterns were innate, genetically hardwired calls, similar to the instinctive howling of a wolf or the barking of a dog. However, advanced acoustic monitoring and decades of tracking have revealed a truth that fundamentally disrupts the barrier between human and animal intelligence. The codas are not genetic, they are entirely cultural. Just as human children learn their specific spoken language by listening to their parents, sperm whale calves learn their specific coda dialects through intense social interaction and vocal imitation within their pod. The global population of sperm whales is divided into distinct massive social factions known as vocal clans. A single clan can consist of thousands of individuals spread across millions of square miles of ocean, yet every member of that specific clan shares a unique, highly specific coda dialect that no other clan utilizes. When 2 different clans cross paths in the open ocean, they do not intermingle, they do not mate, and they do not communicate, separated by an invisible, impenetrable cultural barrier constructed entirely of acoustic rhythms. Within these massive clans, the communication is highly localized and deeply personal. Bioacousticians have isolated specific acoustic patterns known as icodas. These are completely unique rhythmic signatures utilized by individual whales, functioning identically to human names. When a sperm whale enters a new acoustic space, it will repeatedly broadcast its specific icoda, announcing its personal identity to the rest of the pod. The whales engage in highly complex acoustic overlapping, matching each other's tempos and essentially engaging in deep rhythmic conversations that can last for hours. They're sharing information, reinforcing social bonds, and coordinating the logistics of their highly structured matriarchal society. The social structure of the sperm whale is driven by the brutal biological realities of their deep-sea hunting strategy. While adult male sperm whales eventually leave their families to live solitary lives in the freezing, nutrient-rich waters of the polar extremes, returning to the tropics only to mate, the females remain together for their entire lives. They form deeply bonded matrilineal pods consisting of grandmothers, mothers, aunts, and calves. This matriarchal structure is a direct evolutionary response to a severe physiological vulnerability. While an adult female sperm whale can collapse her lungs and plunge into the midnight zone for 90 minutes, a newborn calf lacks the massive myoglobin oxygen batteries and the heavy Spermaceti anchor required to make the deep descent. The calf is biologically tethered to the sunlit surface, unable to follow its mother down to the feeding grounds. If a mother were to leave her calf alone at the surface while she hunted in the abyss for an hour and a half, the calf would be instantly slaughtered by surface predators. Therefore, the pod engages in a highly coordinated, culturally transmitted behaviour known as allomothering or communal babysitting. The mature females stagger their dive times. While one group of mothers descends to battle giant squids in the dark, another group of females remains at the surface, closely guarding the vulnerable calves of the entire pod. They will care for, nurse, and protect any calf in the family, utilising their massive brains to track the dive times and the acoustic locations of the hunting mothers deep below. This communal defence is absolutely critical, because the surface of the ocean is heavily patrolled by the only predator on Earth capable of threatening a sperm whale, the killer whale or orca. Orcas are highly intelligent, highly coordinated pack hunters that view the isolated sperm whale calves as a prime caloric target. When a pod of killer whales detects a group of sperm whales at the surface, they do not attack randomly. They execute highly strategic, high-speed assaults, attempting to isolate a calf and physically force it underwater to drown it. When faced with an incoming orca assault, the sperm whales do not scatter and they do not attempt to flee. Despite their massive size, they cannot outswim the much faster, more agile killer whales. Instead, they rely on their extreme social cohesion and a specialised tactical manoeuvre known as the Marguerite Formation, named for its visual resemblance to a daisy flower. As the orcas close in, the adult female sperm whales rapidly gather the calves and force them into the absolute centre of a tight circle. The massive adults then align their bodies like the spokes of a wheel, radiating outward from the centre. Depending on the exact nature of the threat and the specific cultural tactics of the clan, they will adopt one of two variations of this biological fortress. In the tail-out formation, the whales position their massive heads inward, overlapping their bodies over the calves, and point their colossal, heavily muscled tail flukes directly at the attacking orcas. The tail of a sperm whale is an instrument of immense kinetic destruction. A single sweeping strike from a 50-ton adult can instantly shatter the ribs and rupture the internal organs of an attacking killer whale. The orcas are forced to navigate a chaotic, churning wall of heavy bone and muscle, constantly dodging lethal strikes as they desperately try to breach the circle. Alternatively, the pod may engage the head at Marguerite Formation. In this strategy, the adults face outward, presenting their massive, heavily scarred, indestructible asymmetrical skulls to the enemy. This allows them to utilise their heavy, gripping lower jaws to snap at the attackers, but more importantly, it allows them to unleash their biological acoustic weapons. While an orca is not a giant squid and possesses a different neurological architecture, the sheer concussive hydrostatic force of multiple sperm whales simultaneously firing their 230 decibel sonar clicks at point-blank range is incredibly disorienting and physically painful, effectively creating a wall of agonizing sound that the orcas cannot penetrate. Through this combination of intense matriarchal bonding, cultural communication, and organized tactical defense, the massive brain of the sperm whale ensures the survival of its lineage in a hostile ocean, turning a group of deep-sea hunters into an impenetrable, highly coordinated biological phalanx. While the narrative of the sperm whale is defined by its terrifying dominance as a deep-sea predator, possessing unparalleled acoustic weaponry and pressure-resistant biological engineering, the ultimate legacy of this leviathan extends far beyond the violent destruction of giant squids in the midnight zone. To truly understand the ecological importance of the sperm whale, we must pull back our perspective from the brutal localized battles of the abyss and examine the grand planetary scale mechanics of the global ocean. When viewed through the lens of macroecology and biogeochemistry, the sperm whale ceases to be merely an apex hunter and transforms into a vital, highly efficient biological machine that actively engineers the Earth's climate. It is the primary engine of a phenomenon known as the biological whale pump, a system that fundamentally manipulates the global distribution of limiting nutrients and directly dictates the rate at which our planet processes atmospheric carbon dioxide. To grasp the mechanics of this planetary engineering, we must first recognize a fundamental physical paradox regarding the distribution of life in the open ocean. The surface layer of the ocean, the sunlit epipelagic zone, contains the absolute prerequisite for photosynthesis, boundless solar radiation. However, in the vast open stretches of the deep ocean, far from the coastal runoff of continents, this sunlit surface layer is essentially a biological desert. It is severely depleted of the essential chemical nutrients required to sustain complex food webs. Conversely, the deepest, darkest realms of the ocean, the bathypelagic and abyssopelagic zones, are incredibly rich in these vital nutrients. As biological matter dies at the surface, millions of tons of fish, plankton, and marine mammals slowly sink into the darkness, decomposing and dissolving into the freezing depths. Over thousands of years, this steady downward drift of organic material creates a massive reservoir of trapped chemical wealth at the bottom of the ocean. Under normal physical circumstances, this wealth cannot return to the surface. The ocean is strictly stratified by temperature and density, featuring a stark, impenetrable physical boundary known as the thermocline. The freezing, heavy, nutrient-rich water of the deep cannot naturally mix with the warm, light, nutrient-starved water of the surface. Gravity and fluid dynamics dictate that the vital building blocks of life remain permanently locked in the perpetual darkness. The sperm whale is the biological anomaly that shatters this physical barrier. When a massive 50-ton sperm whale plunges 2,000 meters into the midnight zone, it is not merely hunting, it is actively mining the deep sea. A single adult sperm whale consumes roughly 3% of its massive body weight every single day. This means that a large male can devour over a ton of deep-sea squids and benthic fishes in a single 24-hour period. When the whale crushes and swallows a giant squid, it is essentially absorbing a massive concentrated package of the very biological nutrients that have been trapped in the deep ocean sink. However, as we established during the physiological breakdown of the deep dive, the sperm whale operates under an extreme protocol of metabolic triage. When the whale is actively hunting in the freezing abyss, its intense mammalian dive reflex has forcefully constricted the blood vessels supplying its digestive tract and its massive excretory sphincters. The physical process of digestion and waste elimination requires a tremendous amount of blood flow, metabolic energy, and oxygen. The whale simply cannot afford to waste its localized myoglobin batteries on digesting a meal while it is still locked in combat under 300 atmospheres of hydrostatic pressure. Therefore, the processing of the squid is forcefully paused. It is only when the triumphant whale finally initiates its thermodynamic ascent and breaks the surface of the sunlit ocean that its biological systems reboot. As the whale rests at the surface, heavily hyperventilating to recharge its oxygen reservoirs, intense vasodilation restores massive blood flow to its gastrointestinal tract. The concentrated gastric acids quickly break down the toxic ammonia-soaked flesh of the deep-sea squids. It is here, strictly at the very surface of the ocean, that the most vital step of the whale pump occurs. The sperm whale excretes massive, voluminous plumes of biological waste directly into the sunlit, nutrient-starved epipelagic zone. The physical structure and chemical composition of this fecal matter are of paramount ecological importance. Unlike the dense, solid waste produced by many terrestrial mammals, the feces of the sperm whale are expelled as a highly liquid, flocculent plume. Because the diet of the whale is heavily composed of highly lipid-rich gelatinous squids, the resulting waste is incredibly buoyant. Instead of sinking rapidly back into the dark depths from which its raw materials originated, the liquid fecal plume spreads out laterally, lingering and floating perfectly suspended within the upper 10 to 20 meters of the ocean's surface. This buoyant plume is not merely waste, it is a highly concentrated biological superfertilizer. The two most critical elements contained within this liquid suspension are massive quantities of biologically available nitrogen and iron. In the open ocean, iron is the ultimate limiting factor for all biological growth. Because iron is incredibly heavy and highly insoluble in oxygenated seawater, it rapidly drops out of the surface layer. The only natural way iron is introduced to the open ocean is through rare, massive atmospheric dust storms blowing off the terrestrial deserts. By bringing concentrated iron up from the digested squids of the midnight zone and releasing it in a buoyant liquid state at the surface, the sperm whale is artificially fertilizing the oceanic desert. The immediate biological response to this iron and nitrogen fertilization is explosive. The sunlit surface layer of the ocean is inhabited by massive dormant populations of phytoplankton, microscopic, single-celled marine algae. These organisms are the absolute foundation of the entire marine food web. They wait in a state of suspended animation, starved of iron. The moment the liquid and rich fecal plume of the sperm whale washes over them, the phytoplankton absorb the nutrients and trigger a massive exponential reproductive cycle. Within a matter of days, the once barren stretch of ocean surface erupts into a colossal, vibrant biological bloom, visibly turning the blue water into a thick, cloudy green soup of microscopic life. The consequences of this artificially induced phytoplankton bloom are globally profound. Phytoplankton are photosynthetic organisms. To fuel their explosive cellular division and growth, they must draw massive quantities of carbon dioxide directly out of the surrounding seawater. As the phytoplankton rapidly consume the dissolved carbon dioxide, the ocean surface becomes chemically undersaturated. To regain chemical equilibrium, the ocean physically absorbs millions of tons of atmospheric carbon dioxide directly from the air above it. The sperm whale's biological pump essentially transforms the microscopic algae into a colossal planetary vacuum cleaner, actively stripping carbon dioxide, the primary greenhouse gas driving global climate change, out of the Earth's atmosphere. But the process does not end with absorption. The carbon must be permanently sequestered. As the massive phytoplankton bloom progresses, it sustains an entire explosive food web. The microscopic algae are consumed by immense swarms of zooplankton, such as krill and copepods. These zooplankton in turn are hunted by vast schools of surface fishes. Throughout this frantic biological consumption, organic waste is continuously produced. Furthermore, the phytoplankton that are not eaten eventually reach the end of their short life cycle and die. When these billions of microscopic organisms die, or when the zooplankton excrete their waste, the carbon that was originally stripped from the atmosphere and built into their cellular structures clumps together. This dense, carbon-rich, biological detritus forms what marine biologists refer to as marine snow. Slowly and relentlessly, this marine snow sinks, falling heavily out of the sunlit surface layer, passing back through the thermocline and drifting silently down into the absolute darkness of the abyss. When this carbon-rich snow reaches the benthic floor of the ocean, it is effectively buried in the deep sea sediment. Because the deep ocean is disconnected from the atmosphere by thousands of meters of water and the impenetrable thermocline barrier, this carbon is permanently locked away. It is removed from the global carbon cycle for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The mathematical scale of this planetary terraforming is staggering. Prior to the industrial whaling era, which decimated global sperm whale populations, it is estimated that these deep-diving leviathans numbered well over 1 million individuals. Working tirelessly across every ocean basin on Earth, their daily descents into the dark and their subsequent iron-rich fertilizations at the surface drove an unimaginably massive biological carbon sink. Even today, with their populations drastically reduced, researchers estimate that the global population of sperm whales is responsible for the direct sequestration of millions of tons of atmospheric carbon dioxide every single year. In a profound stroke of ecological irony, the sperm whale effectively cultivates the very food web that eventually sustains its own deep-sea prey. The massive influx of phytoplankton at the surface feeds the zooplankton, which feed the deep-diving mesopelagic fishes, which ultimately descend into the darkness to be consumed by the giant squids. The giant squids then grow massive, waiting in the absolute dark until the sperm whale returns to hunt them, continuing the grand, perpetual biological engine. Therefore, the sperm whale is not merely an apex predator conquering the extreme physics of the deep sea, it is the vital circulatory system of the global ocean. By weaponizing extreme biological engineering, specialized fluid dynamics, and a 230 decibel acoustic arsenal to hunt in the pitch-black void, the sperm whale manages to bridge the impassable physical divide between the crushing, nutrient-rich abyss and the sunlit, starved surface. In doing so, this heavily scarred asymmetrical titan of the dark acts as a massive planetary thermostat, playing an absolutely critical, irreplaceable role in stabilizing the chemical composition of the Earth's atmosphere and defending the global climate. The deep sea is an environment of absolute extremes, a freezing, lightless void governed by crushing hydrostatic pressure and inhabited by some of the most nightmarish invertebrates on the planet. Yet, as we have explored, the deep sea does not dictate the terms of survival to the sperm whale. The sperm whale dictates its terms to the abyss. By willfully abandoning the sunlit surface millions of years ago, this remarkable leviathan engineered itself into an unmatched biological conqueror. It voluntarily collapses its own lungs to completely cheat decompression sickness, supercharges its muscle tissues with positively charged myoglobin proteins to construct massive internal oxygen batteries, and manipulates the thermodynamic properties of its spermaceti wax to sink effortlessly into the dark. It replaced the heavy bone-crushing jaws of its prehistoric ancestors with a wildly asymmetrical skull designed specifically to harness the physics of acoustic fluid dynamics, generating a tightly focused 230 decibel biological laser. This devastating acoustic weapon not only illuminates the absolute darkness, but neurologically paralyzes heavily armed giant squids, reducing the most dangerous invertebrates on Earth to helpless prey that are effortlessly consumed by a violent vacuum of negative hydrostatic pressure. However, the true majesty of the sperm whale transcends its terrifying role as an abyssal sniper. Through the continuous, relentless mechanics of the biological whale pump, it bridges the impassable physical divide of the ocean, hauling vital iron and nitrogen from the benthic depths back to the starved surface. In doing so, it triggers colossal blooms of microscopic life that actively strip millions of tons of carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere, acting as a vital planetary scale engineer that actively stabilizes our global climate. The sperm whale is not just a monster of the deep, it is a masterpiece of extreme biomechanical evolution, the guardian of a highly intelligent matriarchal society, and the living, beating heart of the global ocean ecosystem. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the extreme science of the ocean's greatest predator, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our ongoing exploration of the natural world. Also, be sure to drop a comment below letting us know exactly where and what time you're watching this video.